Hola, hola, bienvenidos a todos. You are listening today and watching our limited short podcast, which is Intergenerational Artivism. And this podcast is going to be a limited one. We're only going to go through about 3 or 4 episodes. However, we hope that as you follow along, you gain a lot of knowledge, a lot of background, and hopefully some inspiration for your own art. So, Intergenerational Artivism, why did we choose this name for this limited podcast? So, Intergenerational Artivism, the first part, intergenerational, we want to make sure that as we're learning, we always want to go back to our roots and our backgrounds, where a lot of the movement started. And so in this podcast, we're going to be talking about artivism, which is kind of just a combined word for art activism. And artivism has been a term that has been growing more recently. And we want to go ahead and combine the intergenerational part to artivism by through this podcast limited series, going over some of the mujeres, some of the chicanas who are really influential to the way that public art is created today. And then I also want to invite you in to kind of reflect and think about what your idea of public art is. So most of the time we think of public art as being solely visionary or visual. So this can either be in the form of paintings and murals, which are all really amazing, and it's actually going to be our topic or one of the topics for episodes. However, we also want to make sure that we're expanding public art to also just mean any public art is an artistic expression of any sort through any medium that is basically accessible to the general public. So this can be through music, radio, theater, magazines, or zines, as we will talk about. And it comes in all these varied ways. And what is essential about public art is the accessibility that it has, and also the way that it is brought into a community and how the community gets to interact with this art, gets to reflect with it, and the way that it either mirrors or displaces the people in the community. So these are just some few insights into the topics that we'll be getting into. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right in. So for our first episode, we're going to go ahead and talk about printed and digital media. So when we talk about printed and digital media, we want to basically talk about anything that is basically written into magazines, zines, which are smaller, more independently created versions of like kind of like a magazine. What a zine kind of calls to action to is that it has its roots in being more open to creative expressions, and they have been used also politically and socially by groups who are more marginalized and don't have the opportunity at time to be represented in these more mainstream and popular magazines. And by digital media, we are going to kind of touch into or tap into one of the Chicana organizations that actually began to use digital media in their zines in order to gain a larger public. So the first one is actually Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc. So if you have not heard about Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, they are an amazing group of Chicana mujeres, and it was originally called Las Chicanas de Aztlán. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, Aztlán is a term that is used amongst Chicanos. More particularly, it grew out in the Chicano movement, and this was in the 1970s. And it basically was a reference to the way that Chicanos are not people who are, this whole idea of we did not cross the border crossed us. Aztlán is our homeland, we are coming back, this is our home, our land. And we as people are not aliens, or not we're migrating back home to a place that should welcome and holds a lot of culture for us. And so therefore, Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc were originally known as Las Chicanas de Aztlán. They actually switched over to Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc later on, and this name was a reference actually to a group of feminists during the Mexican Revolution. So Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc originally was a group of feministas mexicanas en la Revolución Mexicana, and they were a lot of the ones who would go ahead and aid in the political organization. And I would actually want to go ahead and say more than aid. There were some of the ones who took a lot of leadership roles. A lot of the mujeres that do not get the same acknowledgement as their male counterparts, and oftentimes are just recognized as a branch instead of their own independent and also really strong movement. So Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc started around the 1970s, and particularly it was started by two undergraduate students in CSU Long Beach, and their names are Ana Nieto Gomez and Adelaida Castillo. And so one of the purposes that Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc had in their work, so their form of printed art, public art, was through a newspaper, and this was the newspaper that was known went by Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc. And something that we want to highlight about the work that they do is that during this time, something that was really significant was that there was the clash, or kind of this breaking point where there was third wave feminism kind of coming through, which is a recognition to the way that there was like feminism was having this turning point where the women's movement had kind of gained momentum, and there was like rights being fought for women. However, we saw that on the sidelines and marginalized were the voices of women of color, particularly Black and Latina mujeres. And so then we kind of saw how we didn't just want rights for white women, we wanted it for women in general. And so this is where Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc kind of were really influential in their intersectional approach. And they're really big in using their newspaper to highlight the Chicana experience. And they use something that's called retrofitted narratives. So when we talk about retrofitted narratives, one of the purpose of them is to explore the gaps of accepted history and then begin to develop new historical and political imaginaries. So what we mean by this is that we want to kind of use a critical lens on the experiences, but also use narratives and testimonios, which Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc did, to branch out to mass media and talk about these experiences, talk about the contributions that these women have, and also then offer up these retrofitted narratives that by bringing in these testimonials, we fill in these gaps in history about knowledge and people who are often displaced or erased. And then we begin to develop a new approach to history and the political imaginaries of what could be and what has been too. And then later on in the 1990s, we get Mujeres de Maíz. Mujeres de Maíz is also an uprising of women of color. And they kind of begin also to take place more in what is really the highlight and the burst of the third wave feminism. And during this time, something that is particularly happening is the rise of femzines. So femzines is also just another term that combines the two words feminine zines. So there were zines, these short like forms, kind of if it reminds you of magazine is a more tangible way to think about it. And they had a feminist approach, and they were talking about like the feminist movement. And something that we saw, however, was that femzines were largely being dominated by Anglo-American and middle-class youth. And so what Mujeres de Maíz does is it goes ahead and says, hey, we're going to go ahead and we're going to organize Chicanas. We're going to create our own independent group and produce our own femzines. So this was really important, especially during a time where Chicanas, as women and as Chicane, were facing this, what Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc brought out as an intersectional approach. And so then we go ahead and we see how Mujeres de Maíz publishes 14 editions of their zine called Flor y Canto. And I think there's a really beautiful history and meaning behind the name as well. So Flor y Canto in Nahuatl is Xochitl and Cuicatl. And I apologize if that is pronounced incorrectly. But what it translates into is poetry and truth. So Flor y Canto is poetry and truth. And I think this is a really special way of kind of bringing about the way that we think of people as our holders and creators of knowledge. They're people who hold all this truth. And here we see them translating it poetically into these art forms in a way that is tangible, digestible, and accessible to the public. And we see how where women and chicanes, so chicanas, where they have not in the past been able to gain access to mass media, to print production. Here they are saying and taking ownership of these tools that have not been accessed by them before, to then make this form of education that isn't just a gate-kept form of education, how we see it in academia, but it's something that's spreading out wider, and it's saying, hey, education is educación para todos, education for everyone, something where we see that education is something that we all hold. We're all personas educadas. It is more so how we choose to define education and the epistemologies that we use behind that. And so something else also is that the members of Mujeres de Maíz were known as Tlamatini. There we go, Tlamatini, which translates into modern day healers and teachers, which goes on to say just the role that these women played as well. And in this, one of the methodological approaches that Mujeres de Maíz referred to was the use of ofrendas and altares, what they call a reference to altars. So ofrenda and altars, if you see this as a method that is used in art, what it does is that it creates spaces where one invokes, meditates, and offers homage to the unseen but felt presence in our lives, whether these be deities, ancestors, or the memories of our personal, familial, and collective past. And so what these femzines did as public art is that they not only fought for the rights for women, but they also amplified their voices, made sure that we created these ofrendas, these offerings to the community that said, that mirrored them, that showed that we see that you are here, we see the contributions that you're doing, and we want to amplify that. We want to make sure that your voice is heard and that it is given value as well. And so through this, we see the amplification of this message through poetic art and knowledge that paints a picture of beauty, of strength, of unity and independence, where Chicanas were often seen only as a branch rather than the leaders. And then from there, we go on to see that with the creation of like more technology in this technological area, as we move between the 90s and the 2000s, we start to see more digital art being brought in. And so we see this with one of these zines called Malintzin. So it is a reference to Malinche. And so it's something that's really going to be groundbreaking, because with the internet, we see that there's this whole transition into the digital world, and we're continuing to break barriers in the gatekeeping of knowledge. And so the main goal is to make art more accessible. So accessibility is something that we continue to see being brought up. And so what we see here is that we want to make a space of radical learning that is beyond the limitations of school systems and academia. And as we see, the internet is going to be something that is not accessible to everyone immediately. And especially some of the places where we are going to see access is through academia. And so when we see someone coming out and saying, we're going to produce something, we're going to take ownership of this digital world and create our own zine, that is something very powerful that evokes these two other approaches called denuncia and also zapatismo. So denuncia refers to going ahead and coming into these cultures of silence. And when we say cultures of silence, what we're trying to say is being silenced, the marginalization of group, the erasure of their contributions and their presence in history, which is something that we see so often with Chicanes. Even in the sense of names and narratives, we don't see a lot of names where often in like Anglo-American history, we'll see a lot of names included. And that is something that holds so much power in itself. So we see where cultures of silence refer to this marginalization and erasure of groups in the shadowing through dominant narratives. So what denuncia does is it breaks this silence and it goes ahead and says, we are no longer silent. And to do this, they use something called zapatismo. So zapatismo is something that basically is a pushback, and it refers to the political organization, and it also refers to the building up of a system. And the way that these mujeres will do it is through storytelling and listening. So we see in Malintzin that some of the topics that are going to be brought up are going to be not just going ahead and producing topics, but also getting people to think more critically and reflect on their social positions and social standings, which will be a very powerful tool that's going to go ahead and encourage a whole new era for what can be believed in the future. And we're going to go ahead and also talk about that more with the murals that go on to be created, some of the theater groups that come out later on, and even today in modern days, something that is called Chicana Futurism. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, and we're going to go ahead and pick up on the next episode. This is Annie Abundi signing off on the first episode of Intergenerational Artivism. See you later, Artivistas.